Hello everyone and welcome back to Mastering the edTPA. Today we're talking about Task 1, the lesson plan. So here we go. You may recall that for Task 1, the big idea is that you are going to have a central focus. You'll divide that into learning segments, 3 to 5 learning segments. And for each of those, you will create learning targets. You'll list the assessments you'll use, whatever instructional materials you're going to use, and also the instructional activities that you plan on engaging in. And you'll design all of this with your specific students in mind. And you'll write all of those up, each of those learning segments up into a discrete lesson plan. So there will be a lesson plan for learning segment 1, a lesson plan for learning segment 2, etc. And you'll justify all of this in the Task 1 planning commentary, explaining why you made the decisions you made. We'll talk about the planning commentary later. For now, I want to focus on the lesson plan itself. So you see here in the instructional plan, this is Northwest University's instructional plan. It's aligned with the edTPA. It starts off by asking, what is the central focus? And that central focus is your overarching goal for the 3 to 5 lessons. So are you working on dividing fractions, or on cellular reproduction, or identifying causes of the Civil War, or learning basketball fundamentals, whatever this may be. I don't know what that's going to be for you, but the central focus will be the same for each of your daily lesson plans here. You have the Common Core standards, or whatever standards are appropriate for your discipline, and then you have the learning target. And this learning target is going to be different for every day that you have. So if you have three lessons, you'll have 3 different learning targets for those 3 days, but they'll all be related to the same central focus. The essential question is optional. You don't actually have to do that. The edTPA does not ask you about that. And then below there, you start listing the assessment strategies that you plan to use for this day's lesson. So you might have a pre-assessment. You will, I would imagine, have formative assessments throughout the way. Maybe you're checking in on student progress. Maybe it's a fist to 5 or a thumbs up or an exit ticket or any other kind of formative assessment. You will probably have a check-in at the end of the day, a summative assessment to see if they met the learning target for that day. And then you'll also be gathering student voice information. How are students understanding their own progress towards their learning target? We will talk about that more later on. But I want to highlight right now, this central focus, like I said, is going to be the same for every single lesson. That should not change. It should be a word-for-word copy from lesson 1 into lesson 2 into lesson 3, and so on. I also want to highlight that the learning target for this lesson needs to be written in student-friendly format, and then it also needs to be later on in Task 3, when you actually analyze student work, one of these learning targets that you choose has to show up again in Task 3, word for word. Whatever learning targets you say you're going to do here need to be the learning targets that you actually do. And then finally, I want to highlight this, that you might not have all of these assessment strategies in one lesson. So you might have a pre-assessment on lesson 1 and not on lesson 2. You might not have a pre-assessment. That would be okay. You might not have a summative assessment until the end of the 3 to 5 lessons, or you might have one on a daily basis. You might not have student voice every single day. You do not have to have every single one of these every single day. What's important is that you address whatever assessments you're going to have in this particular lesson in this space. I want to make that very clear. You don't have to have all of these every single day. Please don't try to squeeze them in if they're not appropriate. The second page of the lesson plan looks like this. It starts off at the top asking about instructional strategies. How are you going to group students? Are you going to have an anticipatory set or a review? How are you communicating learning targets? How are you factoring academic language in? And other strategies. Notice that most of those have asterisks next to them. And if you look down below where it's yellow, it says these can be removed because they're not mentioned in the edTPA handbook and they're not required to be included. The reason we have them here is because oftentimes they're really important to think about and they make for good planning. But the edTPA does not ask, how did you group students? It doesn't ask how you activated prior knowledge. So you don't have to address those. In fact, you could cut those out. However, I recommend that you are thinking actively about those things, because even though it doesn't ask specifically about them, you could bring them up as examples of how you, say, accommodated for students. Now, communicating learning targets, the edTPA is going to ask you about, but it doesn't have to be in your lesson plan. It will ask you to talk about it in your commentary. And so I've put it in the lesson plan to force you to think about it, because you need to be thinking about it. But there's another place where you're going to address it. Academic language content is the same way. You're going to have to address it explicitly in the commentary. So we've put it in the lesson plan to make you think about it, knowing that you don't have to write it up here, but you should be thinking about it here. And then the next section, learning experiences and instructional sequence, this can be bullet pointed, or you can write it as a narrative. Either way works. So here's what I want to highlight. Like I said, you will be talking about communicating learning targets and about academic language in the commentary, in the task 1 commentary. You don't have to address them here, but we put them here just as a reminder that it's something you need to be thinking about. I also want to show you that the accommodations and modifications section. If you remember, in the context for learning, I said that whatever you list, or if you list any students with 504s or IEPs here, you have to address them in the lesson plan, specifically these students. This is where you do that. So if your context for learning has 2 students with IEPs, you have to address in every single lesson what accommodations or modifications am I going to do for those students who have the IEPs. And you have to be specific. This is the spot to do that. I also want to highlight for you this section right here of instructional materials and resources and technology. At this point in time, you can bullet point list. I will, you can list handouts you might use, or resources like a word wall or manipulatives. But there's another form entirely we're going to talk about where you actually give examples of those. That's not in the lesson plan. In the lesson plan, you simply list them. And there's another document we will create later on where you give examples, and you actually have copies of those. We'll talk about that later. So the takeaways for the lesson plans. You're going to design 3 to 5 consecutive lessons, up to 4 pages each. So theoretically, there could be up to 20 pages of lesson plans, but no more than 4 pages for any one lesson plan. You're going to submit them all as one file. So you'll just add them all up in one Word document, and that's what you will submit. Whatever learning targets you list in your 3 to 5 consecutive lesson plans must be the word-for-word learning targets that you teach in task 2 and that you assess in task 3. Whatever you say you're going to do needs to be what you actually do. If you do deviate from that, you have to account for the deviation. It's okay to deviate, but you have to explain why you deviated. And the assessments and instructional materials that you list will be the ones that you actually upload. And that will be the next video. This is fairly straightforward, it's fairly easy, and this should not be surprising or seem too difficult to anybody. This is simply writing up a lesson plan, but we've scaffolded it for you to think about the things you need to be including and that you'll have to be writing about in your commentary.